It is the evening of April 11th, 1950. In the foothills southeast of Albuquerque, the desert is shifting from its warm 70-degree temps to the expected chills of the cool desert night, in a process familiar to all Burqueños. At the local military airfield, it is business as usual. Wayward B-29 superfortresses sit on the parking apron carrying special cargo, sent to Kirtland Air Force Base in the midst of a military maneuver. The air crews are briefed by base operations prior to takeoff, with special instructions for the next leg of their journey to Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth, Texas. Approaching 9 p.m., the crew of B-29 serial number 45-21854 head to their aircraft. Their business at Kirtland is complete for the day, and their next destination is roughly 3 hours away. The captain and the co-pilot start to run through their takeoff checklists. The radio operator, navigator, and flight engineer do equipment checks to ensure the crew and their cargo reach their destination safely. These men are not new to the job. They are professionals belonging to the 509th Bombardment Wing and some of the best within Strategic Air Command's Atomic Strike Crews. Collectively, the 13-member crew has thousands of flight hours in the wild blue yonder, over areas as dangerous as the skies over Germany and Japan during World War II, and as benign as the featureless desert landscape of the southwestern United States. Given direction from the Kirtland Air Force Base Air Traffic Control Tower, 854 heads towards runway 08. Since the military maneuver contains many aircraft from the 509th Bombardment Wing, 854 awaits approval to take off. Sister ship 748 is first in line, with 854 next to depart. The waning crescent moon briefly outlines faint shadows on runway 08's threshold, as Superfortress 748 performs a rolling start down the runway, lifting into the star-filled sky and banking towards the southeast. Now it is 854's place at the head of the line. The captain and co-pilot synchronize their actions and advance the throttles as the aircraft continues to move across the threshold. Continuing down the runway, the flight engineer monitors the cylinder head temperatures and manifold pressures as the heavy silver beast lumbers into the air. Approximately 3 minutes after takeoff, a bright fireball of red, orange, and yellow burst from the Manzanita foothills. Kirtland Tower radios 854 for a status update, and here's nothing but static. This is Boomtown. I'm your host, Joe Page, military historian and longtime New Mexican. We're going to explore the crash of B-29 Superfortress 854 on April 11th, 1950, and its place in history as the first declared nuclear weapons accident in the continental United States. This is Episode 1, What is a Broken Arrow? On today's episode of Boomtown, we'll discuss what a broken arrow is and is not, and talk about the details of the April 11th, 1950 crash from the official report. I'll be reading passages from U.S. government directives that define the term broken arrow as it relates to nuclear weapon accidents. While most of the facts about the crash are available to the public, some details about the accident remain classified. I will make no attempt to delve into those areas here. I leave it up to the listener to investigate further using the resources at their disposal. We're going to pause and take a quick 30-second break here. As a quick reminder, this podcast is 100% community funded. No network bosses, no mid-roll clutter. If you value this kind of independent research and production, consider joining our community on Patreon at patreon.com/joepage2. That's patreon.com/joepage and the number 2. For the cost of a coffee a month, you can support research efforts to help me bring stories like this out of the historical shadows. Sign up today and fall right in line after my number one fan, my mom. Thanks, Mom! Now, let's pivot and discuss what is a broken arrow. So, let's set the stage about American nuclear weapons accidents and the funny terms used to describe them. I will cover a few of them here, called flag words, and their official definitions. However, I will not go into any specifics on any real-world examples. Details on some of these accidents are still quite sensitive, kind of like a bad case of sunburn in the scorching New Mexico sun. The internet seems to have the answers for everything these days. So if you're really interested in learning more about these after this episode, feel free to query Googlebox or your favorite AI chatbot. Before I go into the definitions, I'm going to take you back to a strange time in history called the 1990s. During this decade, approximately 15 prominent feature films or TV movies had plots focused on nuclear weapons, stolen warheads, or threats of nuclear war. The 1990s kick started off with The Hunt for Red October and By Dawn's Early Light. It also included Under Siege, Crimson Tide, The Peacemaker, True Lies, and the James Bond pair GoldenEye and The World Is Not Enough. Thank goodness Hollywood scripts do not represent reality, because I'd seriously have to wonder if any American or Russian nuclear weapons were even locked up or guarded, seeing how B-movie actors with flimsy film plots saw nukes being stolen, lost, banged up, or detonated on a whim. On February 9th, 1996, moviegoers were subjected to a cinematic train wreck disguised as a high-octane action thriller directed by famed Hong Kong martial arts schlockmaster John Woo, titled, you guessed it, Broken Arrow. The film contained a multitude of bad lines delivered poorly by B-movie actors, barely phoning in their roles. One exception, based on the words, not the actor or the delivery, was a great quote by one of the minor characters. After being informed that a nuclear weapon has gone missing, he says, I don't know what's scarier, losing nuclear weapons, or that it happens so often there's actually a term for it. This quote was about the only memorable thing from the movie. That and the guy delivering the line was famous in Pulp Fiction for repeating, what? Before getting gunned down by a Bible-toting Samuel L. Jackson. Regardless of the crap written in that script, the term broken arrow rose from bureaucratic doldrums as an obscure definition to gaining the public's attention, because of whatever that movie was about. Now, lucky for us, some wordsmiths and policy writers actually wrote definitions for the term broken arrow, which are inside Air Force Manual 91-221, titled Weapons, Safety Investigations, and Reports. I'm referencing the March 26, 2020 version here. Here goes. Broken arrow is a flag word to designate accidental, unauthorized, or unexplained events that could not create the risk of war, but meets any of the following criteria. An accidental or unauthorized launching, firing, or use by U.S. forces or U.S.-supported allied forces of a nuclear-capable weapons system. An accidental, unauthorized, or unexplained nuclear detonation. A non-nuclear detonation, no nuclear yield, or burning of a nuclear weapon or nuclear component. Plutonium or uranium contamination from a U.S. nuclear weapon or component. The public hazard, actual or perceived, and the jettisoning of a nuclear weapon or nuclear component. While I'm reading from a 2020 document, I've tried to find earlier declassified documents defining what a broken arrow is. Since I've had no luck finding anything really old, for the sake of argument within this podcast, I'm going to stick with the definition I just read. There are other definitions within Air Force Manual 91-221 that make interesting reading, but I won't cover them here since they're not relevant to this story. However, I will say that John Woo's movie should have been more accurately titled Empty Quiver. But really, would you have paid good money to see a movie called Empty Quiver? Yeah, me neither. Now that we know what a broken arrow is, an accidental event involving nuclear weapons that could not create the risk of war, let's look at the official description of the April 1950 crash outside of Albuquerque. Before we dive more into the history of 854 and her crew, I'd like to ask a quick favor. If you're enjoying the episode, hit that follow button on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and drop us a review. It really helps other like-minded nuclear nutjobs and historic heretics find the show. Now, back to the broken arrow. Well, in the decades after the 1950 accident in Albuquerque, limited details of the declared broken arrows, all 32 of them, were released to the public in 1977, 1980, and 1981. Let me back up a second here. If you wonder why I keep referring to the accident as the 1950 accident near Albuquerque, it's for two reasons. 1950 was a really bad year to carry a nuclear weapon on board a military aircraft. 6 broken arrows occurred in 1950, the most in any one calendar year. And Albuquerque has the distinction of being ground zero for not one, but 2 declared broken arrows. The accident in 1950 and another one in 1957. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. Perhaps ground zero is a wrong choice of words. What prevented the authorities from releasing more information about the crash of 854 were concerns about public safety, maintaining secrecy about the nuclear technology, and other political considerations during the height of the Cold War. The report I am reading from, disclosing the 32 accidents, was simply titled DoD Nuclear Mishaps and released in March 1986 by the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute. This report is a great read, and I encourage you to browse through its 24 pages when you get a chance. The second chronological disaster listed in the report is described as follows. 11 April 1950, B-29, Manzano Foothills, New Mexico. The B-29 aircraft departed Kirtland Air Force Base at 9:38 p.m. and approximately 3 minutes later crashed into the Manzano Foothills, killing the crew. Detonators were installed in the bomb on board the aircraft. The bomb case was demolished, and some high explosive material burned in the gasoline fire. Other pieces of unburned high explosive were scattered throughout the wreckage. 4 spare detonators in their carrying case were recovered undamaged. Contamination did not occur, and there were no recovery problems. The recovered components of the weapon were returned to the Atomic Energy Commission. A capsule of nuclear material was on board the aircraft, but had not been inserted into the weapon for safety reasons. A nuclear detonation was not possible. The last 2 sentences are important to note, because without the insertion of nuclear material into the bomb case, a nuclear detonation was not possible. There are plenty of references and diagrams on the internet describing early weapons design. I encourage you to do some extra research into your budding future nuclear weapons design career. Since I believe in the adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, it would do no good to describe here what you can see illustrated on Wikipedia or during the 2+ hour movie Oppenheimer. So, sorry to say, no nuclear physics discussions today. If the report strikes you as cold and callous regarding the loss of the crew, understand that this report focused solely on the cargo of nuclear material and their delivery systems, not the crew. For the events with the loss of an aircraft, ship, or missile, and corresponding loss of life, there is always an accident report done by the military service, in this case, the U.S. Air Force. When the accident occurred, the U.S. Air Force, as the newest military service, had only been around for approximately 2.5 years. The service stood up on September 18, 1947, with the passage of the 1947 National Security Act, creating the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, yes, that's CIA, the Air Force, and organizing the military services under the National Military Establishment, which was later renamed in 1949 as the Department of Defense. Being so close to the wartime days of the U.S. Army Air Forces, there's a lot of leftover paper inventory, so the accident form still had Army Air Forces Report of Major Accident stamped at the top. The description of the accident reads as B-29 aircraft number 45-21854 landed at Kirtland Air Force Base at 18:27 Mountain Standard Time. Upon landing, the pilot reported that the aircraft was in good condition. His taxi instructions for takeoff after loading were that takeoff would be on runway 8, winds variable at 20, altimeter setting 30.5. 845 was notified that between 8 to 10 miles east, the ground rises gradually to 8,000 feet. Make a right turn after takeoff. This call was acknowledged. 854 was airborne at 2138 MST. People who were watching noticed that it did not climb to the normal 500 feet right away, but rather proceeded straight out and low until the lights could no longer be discerned from Kirtland. At 2141 MST, a thin line of fire was noted on the foothills east of Kirtland, which within about 5 seconds mushroomed into a large billow of flames. The tower tried to contact 854 and when unable to do so, rang the crash alarm. No sound of explosion was heard at Kirtland or Sandia. The words in the report give a chilling description of what occurred that night to the crew and aircraft impacting the foothills east of Kirtland's Runway 08. This document remains the sole record of facts and determinations relating to the crash of 854 on April 11, 1950. Well, that's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening to Boomtown, the limited podcast series focusing on the first declared nuclear weapons accident in the continental United States. Today, we introduce the final moments of B-29-854 before its fateful impact east of Albuquerque. We also talked about the official definition of a broken arrow accident, and briefly slammed the horrific slew of nuclear weapons-related movies in the 1990s. If there were any hours I'd like to get back in my life, it would be the hours spent watching some of those films. Finally, we covered the official Air Force accident report from the April 1950 crash, and touched on a few of the topics we'll cover in depth in future podcasts. Thanks for listening to this episode of Boomtown, and be sure to check out our next episode.